Tonight, I want to take you to a place that almost disappeared from history. 600 years ago, if you had travelled through this corner of eastern France, you probably would not have remembered it. There were no great castles rising above the hills, no crowded marketplaces filled with merchants, and no magnificent cathedral drawing pilgrims from distant lands. There were only quiet fields, a gentle river, a handful of narrow roads, and the peaceful rhythm of ordinary life.
Every morning began in much the same way. Before the mist had fully lifted from the valley, the church bell echoed across the fields. Thin streams of smoke drifted from the chimneys of stone cottages as families prepared for another day of work. Stable doors creaked open. Dogs barked somewhere in the distance. An axe struck fresh wood, its sound carrying through the cool morning air, while inside a nearby home, bread was already baking long before the children awoke. If you had stood there on that morning, you would almost certainly have believed that nothing important would ever happen in this village. And that would have been a perfectly reasonable thought.
History usually remembers great cities. It remembers kings, famous generals, powerful nobles, and magnificent palaces. It rarely remembers small farming villages where only a few hundred people lived, and where families measured the passing years by harvests, changing seasons, and the ringing of a church bell. Yet history has a curious habit of ignoring our expectations. Sometimes it passes by magnificent castles without stopping. Sometimes it quietly enters a place that almost no one has noticed.
This village was called Domrémy. It stood beside the River Meuse, close to the uncertain frontier between lands whose loyalties changed more often than the people who lived there wished they would. Travellers occasionally passed through with news from the outside world. Merchants spoke about roads that had become unsafe. Pilgrims repeated stories heard many miles away. Some of those stories faded almost as quickly as they were told. Others would change the course of history.
But not today. Today felt wonderfully ordinary. An old farmer repaired a broken fence before leading his horse into the fields. Two young boys laughed as they chased one another through the damp grass until their mother called them home. A blacksmith opened the shutters of his workshop, while the village priest prepared the little church for the first prayers of the morning. No one hurried. No one believed they were standing at the beginning of one of the most remarkable stories in European history.
Because history rarely announces its arrival. It begins quietly, long before battles are fought, before banners are raised, and before kings are forced to make impossible choices. More often than not, history begins on an ordinary morning that nobody thinks to remember. This was one of those mornings, and somewhere in the quiet village of Domrémy, a little girl was beginning another day exactly like every other. At least, that was what everyone believed. Morning arrived gently in Domrémy. By the time the mist had begun to lift, sunlight was already finding its way across the River Meuse. The water moved without hurry, slipping quietly between grassy banks, as it had done for centuries before anyone could remember. Willows leaned over the river's edge, their branches brushing the surface whenever the wind became strong enough to stir them. The river never seemed to change. Children believed it had always looked this way. Their parents believed the same. Perhaps their grandparents had thought so too. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell, the Meuse appeared wonderfully indifferent to human affairs. Every morning the village settled into its familiar rhythm. Women crossed narrow paths carrying baskets of freshly washed linen. Fishermen checked simple nets in the calmer bends of the river. Nearby, the village mill turned steadily, its wheel powered by the current that never seemed to rest. Life moved without haste, and no one felt any reason to hurry.
The river was more than water. It quietly connected the people of Domrémy. Children came here to play. Travellers stopped to water their horses. Neighbours exchanged news while filling wooden buckets. Even those with little time to spare often paused for a moment, watching leaves drift downstream toward places they would never see. For the villagers, the river measured the passing of life itself, through spring floods, summer sunlight, autumn rain, and the silence of winter ice.
Perhaps that is why distant events always felt strangely unreal. Wars belonged somewhere beyond the horizon. Kings belonged to distant castles. Great decisions were made in places most villagers would never visit. Yet the river carried more than water. It carried stories. Travellers arriving from the north sometimes spoke of dangerous roads. Pilgrims repeated rumours heard many miles away. A wandering priest quietly mentioned soldiers seen near the frontier. Some stories disappeared before sunset. Others remained.
Among the children who wandered these riverbanks was a quiet girl who often seemed content simply to watch. She watched sunlight dance across the water. She watched birds rise suddenly from the reeds. She watched leaves disappear around gentle bends where the river slipped quietly out of sight. Like every other child in the village, she had no way of knowing where the river finally ended, or where life itself might one day carry her.
Many years later, people would remember battles, kings, cathedrals, trials, victories, and defeats. But before all of those things, there was a river, quiet, patient, and unchanging. It flowed beside a village that still believed the rest of the world was very far away. And beside that river, a young girl was growing up, unaware that one day her own name would travel much farther than the water ever could.
The house where Joan was born was small, sturdy, and built to last. Thick stone walls protected the family from winter winds, while a heavy timber roof sheltered them through rain, snow, and the changing seasons. It was not a place of luxury, but it was filled with everything a farming family truly needed. Warmth came from the large hearth at the center of the home, where fire burned almost every day of the year.
Long before sunrise, the house was already awake. Flames crackled softly beneath an iron cooking pot as Joan's mother prepared the morning meal. Fresh bread, baked the day before, waited on the wooden table beside simple bowls and clay cups. Smoke drifted slowly toward the roof beams, carrying with it the familiar scent of burning oak that settled into every corner of the home.
Every member of the family had work to do. Joan's father managed the fields and cared for the livestock, while her mother looked after the household and taught her children the practical skills that every village child was expected to learn. There was little time to waste because each season brought its own demands, and every pair of hands mattered.
Joan grew up surrounded by ordinary routines that rarely changed. She learned how to spin wool, mend clothing, carry water, and help prepare meals. She watched bread rise beside the fire, listened to conversations between neighbors, and learned the prayers that shaped daily life. Nothing about her childhood suggested that history would one day remember her name. To anyone passing through Domrémy, this family looked no different from the others. They worked hard,
respected their neighbours, attended church faithfully, and hoped for peaceful harvests. Their greatest concerns were the weather, the condition of the crops, and whether the coming winter would be kind. These were the quiet concerns shared by countless families across medieval France.
Yet it was inside this ordinary home, beside the warmth of a simple fire, that the foundations of an extraordinary life were quietly being laid. No visitor could have guessed it. No neighbour could have imagined it. The little girl sitting beside the hearth was still only Joan, the daughter of a farming family, living one peaceful day after another.
In Domrémy, news rarely arrived on time. It travelled at the pace of horses, weary feet, and muddy roads. Sometimes a story took weeks to reach the village. Sometimes it changed completely before it arrived. That was simply how the world worked. There were no newspapers, no printed maps, no one standing in the village square to announce what had happened beyond the hills. Instead, the outside world arrived one traveller at a time.
Late one afternoon, as the day's work was drawing to a close, a horse appeared on the northern road. It was not unusual for travellers to pass through Domrémy. Merchants came with cloth, salt, and iron tools. Pilgrims rested before continuing toward distant shrines. Messengers occasionally hurried through without stopping at all. But this rider was different. His horse was tired. Its legs were covered with dried mud. The man's cloak was stained with dust from many days on the road. He did not look like someone returning from trade. He looked like someone carrying difficult news.
Before long, a few villagers gathered near the well. No one interrupted him. People simply listened. Another town had changed hands. Soldiers had been seen farther north. Several roads were no longer considered safe after sunset. No one raised their voice. There was no panic, only quiet nods. The sort of nods that suggested these stories had been heard before. One by one, the villagers thanked the traveller and returned to their homes. The animals still needed feeding. The bread still needed baking. Morning would arrive whether kingdoms were at war or not. Life, somehow, always insisted on continuing.
Yet something had changed. The conversation followed people home. That evening it lingered beside the fire. Parents spoke more softly than usual. Children noticed. Children always notice. They may not understand every word, but they recognize concern long before they understand its cause. Among those listening was Jeanne. She heard the names of places she had never visited. She heard adults mention soldiers, roads, borders, the Dauphin, the King of England. Most of those names meant very little to her. Not yet.
But she understood something far simpler. The peaceful world she knew did not exist by itself. Beyond the fields, beyond the forests, beyond the quiet river, there was another France. A France that seemed restless. A France where decisions made by distant rulers could quietly reach even the smallest village. That evening, after the traveller had continued on his way, Domrémy became quiet once more. The church bell marked the end of the day. Smoke drifted above the cottages. The stars slowly appeared over the valley. From a distance, nothing seemed different. But history rarely arrives all at once. It comes the way that rider came, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed, until one ordinary day, people suddenly realize that the world around them is no longer the same.
And although Jeanne could not yet understand it, the road that had carried the traveller into Domrémy would one day carry her away from it.
The bell of St. Remy Church rang every morning. It rang at noon. It rang again as evening settled over the valley. No one in Domrémy needed to ask what time it was. The bell answered that question long before clocks became part of everyday life. Its sound reached the fields where farmers worked. It echoed across the River Meuse. It drifted through open windows and quiet lanes, becoming so familiar that most villagers hardly noticed it anymore. Some sounds become part of a place. The church bell was one of them.
For Jeanne, the walk to the church had become as familiar as the path leading to her own home. She knew every bend in the lane, every old oak tree that shaded the road during summer, every stone step worn smooth by generations of feet. Nothing about the journey ever seemed remarkable, yet she never hurried it. The church itself was modest. Its walls were built for prayer, not grandeur. There were no soaring towers like those found in the great cathedrals of France, no magnificent stained glass filling the interior with coloured light. Only rough stone, wooden benches, the quiet glow of candles, and a silence that seemed different from the silence outside.
For medieval Christians, faith was not reserved for Sundays alone. It shaped the rhythm of the entire year. Holy days determined the calendar. Feasts and fasts marked the passing seasons. Birth, marriage, illness, and death all found their place within the life of the church. Jeanne grew up in that world. According to those who later knew her well, she attended Mass regularly and took her faith seriously from an early age. Such devotion was respected, but it was not unusual. Many people in Domrémy lived with the same quiet sincerity. Nothing yet suggested that Jeanne's life would take a different path.
If you had seen her entering the church on an ordinary morning, you would have noticed nothing extraordinary. A village girl, simple clothing, head bowed in prayer, one face among many. History often tempts us to search childhood for obvious signs of greatness, clear predictions, remarkable talents, moments that seem to announce the future. Real life is rarely so generous. The surviving records reveal something far more human. They show a girl who prayed, who worked, who listened, who grew up much like countless other children across medieval France. And yet, sometimes the greatest turning points in history begin so quietly that no one notices them at first. Not with a battle, not with a proclamation, not even with a single unforgettable day, but with a change so small that it can hardly be measured while it is happening. Years later, Jeanne would say that around this period of her life, something began to happen that she could never forget. She spoke of it carefully. She never described it as a story meant to impress others. She spoke of it because, to her, it had become part of the truth of her own life.
Exactly what happened belongs to one of the most discussed questions in medieval history, and that quiet question would soon begin to change not only Jeanne's future, but the future of France itself. History rarely tells us the exact moment when an ordinary life begins to change. There is no music, no dramatic announcement, no voice declaring that everything will be different from this day forward. Most turning points pass almost unnoticed. It was probably much the same for Jeanne. The surviving records do not tell us what the weather was like that day. They do not tell us what she ate that morning, or whether the fields were busy with spring work. History preserves only fragments. The rest has been carried away by time. According to Jeanne's own testimony, she was about 13 years old when her life changed forever.
It happened close to her father's garden. The church stood nearby, just as it always had. The familiar bell had marked another ordinary day. Nothing seemed unusual. Sunlight fell across the village in the same way it had the day before. The wind moved gently through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, someone was repairing a cart. Life continued exactly as it always did. And then, something happened that Jeanne would remember for the rest of her life. Many years later, during her trial, she described the moment with remarkable consistency. She said that she first became aware of a voice. She also spoke of a great brightness, not darkness, not fear, light. It is important to pause here. Everything we know about this moment comes primarily from Jeanne herself, speaking many years later, under oath during her trial. No one else stood beside her. No one else could describe what she experienced. Historians therefore distinguish carefully between what Jeanne said happened and how different people have interpreted it ever since.
Jean herself never seemed uncertain. She believed the experience came from God. In later testimony, she identified the figures she believed had spoken to her as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret. Whether one approaches those words through faith, history, psychology, or another perspective, one fact remains beyond dispute. Jean's own life changed completely after that day. At first, she told no one. How could she? What words could possibly explain an experience that no one else had shared?
She continued helping her family. She continued walking the same familiar paths. She continued attending Mass. From the outside, nothing appeared different. Yet inwardly, she would later say, everything had begun to change. The voice did not ask her to become famous. It did not promise an easy life. It did not speak of glory. Instead, according to Jeanne, it called her towards something that seemed almost impossible to imagine. A task, a responsibility, a future far beyond the quiet fields of Domrémy. For a 13-year-old village girl, such an idea would have been overwhelming, and perhaps that is why she did not immediately leave. She listened, she prayed, she waited. Outside, the seasons continued to change. The river Meuse flowed quietly past the village. The church bell still marked the hours. The people of Domrémy saw the same Jeanne they had always known. They could not see what had begun within her. No one could. Not yet. But from that quiet afternoon onward, the road that had once seemed to end at the edge of the village had become something very different. It had become a path leading toward a destiny that neither Jeanne nor anyone around her could yet fully understand.
For a long time, nothing changed. At least, that is how it appeared to everyone around Jeanne. She still rose before sunrise. She still helped her family with the day's work. She still walked the familiar path to St. Remy Church. If the people of Domrémy noticed anything unusual, they never spoke of it. And perhaps there was nothing to notice. Some of the greatest changes in a person's life happen where no one else can see them. Jeanne later said that the voices did not come only once. They returned. Not every day, not at every moment, but often enough that she no longer thought of them as a single extraordinary experience. Instead, they became part of her life. She listened, she prayed, she waited. According to her testimony, the voices did not ask her to seek recognition. They did not promise safety. They did not tell her that the path ahead would be easy. If anything, they asked the opposite. They asked her to trust. That may sound simple. It rarely is, especially for a young girl
whose entire world extended little farther than the fields surrounding Domrémy. Every familiar place reminded her of the life she had always known. The river, the church bell, the narrow road leading home, the warmth of the family hearth. Everything suggested that her future had already been written. Most daughters remained close to their families. Most married. Most raised children. Most lived and died within a few miles of the place where they had been born. There was honour in that life. There was nothing small about it. It was simply the life almost everyone expected.
Jean understood those expectations. That is what makes the next part of her story so remarkable. She did not rush into the unknown. The historical record gives us no image of an impatient girl eager for adventure. Quite the opposite. Years passed. She continued living as before, while the conviction she described quietly grew stronger. Outside the village, the war continued. Travellers still arrived with troubling news. The names of distant towns appeared more often in conversations. The uncertainty that had once seemed far away was moving steadily closer.
Inside Jeanne, another kind of journey was unfolding. One no road could measure. One no companion could witness. One that required a different kind of courage. Not the courage to face an enemy, but the courage to believe something that no one else could yet see. History often celebrates the moment when someone acts. Far less attention is given to the long months or even years that come before the first step. Those silent years mattered. Without them, nothing that followed would have been possible.
One afternoon, as Jeanne walked home beneath the familiar sound of the church bell, she paused for a moment and looked across the fields that had framed her entire childhood. Everything was exactly as it had always been. The same cottages, the same river, the same distant woods. Yet she no longer looked at them in quite the same way. For the first time, home felt like both a place she loved and a place she might one day have to leave. She did not know when. She did not know how. She only knew that the quiet certainty growing within her had become impossible to ignore. The road beyond Domrémy was still empty, but it would not remain empty forever.
Every village has a place where the familiar world seems to end. In Domrémy, it was the northern road. It wound gently between fields and low hills before disappearing behind a line of ancient trees. From there, it continued toward towns most villagers would never visit and roads few children would ever travel. To Jeanne, that road had always been part of the landscape, nothing more. She had watched merchants disappear along it, pilgrims, messengers, the occasional soldier riding toward places whose names meant little to her. They always vanished behind the same distant hill. Until now, she had never imagined following them.
Life in Domrémy still moved with comforting regularity. The bell of St. Remy Church continued to mark the passing hours. The River Meuse flowed quietly beyond the fields. Children laughed in the village lanes. The seasons asked the same work of every family as they always had. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet Jeanne herself no longer measured time by the seasons alone. According to her later testimony, the conviction she carried continued to grow stronger. She believed she had not simply been given a message, she had been given a task. That difference mattered. A message can be remembered. A task asks to be completed.
For months, perhaps longer, she remained where she had always been. She prayed, she worked, she waited. Not because she doubted what she believed, but because knowing what must be done is very different from knowing when to begin. History rarely records such waiting. It remembers departures, victories, trials. It seldom remembers the quiet days when a life is changing invisibly. Those days shaped Jean as surely as anything that followed.
Sometimes, after finishing her work, she walked beyond the edge of the village where the fields opened toward the road. From there, she could watch travelers appear as tiny figures in the distance before slowly disappearing once again beyond the hills. Each of them was going somewhere. Each carried a destination known only to themselves. Jeanne remained where she was, for now. The world beyond Domrémy no longer felt impossibly distant. It felt possible. Not easy, not safe, simply possible.
The war that had once arrived only as rumours carried by strangers now seemed to be drawing steadily closer. Travellers spoke more often of Charles, of the English, of towns changing hands, of uncertainty spreading across the kingdom. The names that had once sounded distant were becoming strangely familiar. One afternoon, Jeanne stood watching the northern road longer than usual. The wind moved gently through the grass. A pair of crows crossed the pale autumn sky. Somewhere behind her, the church bell marked another passing hour. Everything around her seemed exactly as it always had. Everything within her had changed. Soon she understood remaining silent would no longer be enough. Soon what had been carried only in prayer would have to be spoken aloud. And once spoken, nothing in her life could ever be ordinary again.
Some decisions remain private for a very long time. Others become real the moment they are spoken aloud. For Jeanne, that moment had finally arrived. The words she had carried silently for years could no longer remain unspoken. Someone else had to hear them. Not because she wanted attention, but because the journey she believed she had been called to make could never begin without help. A girl from a farming village could not simply ride across a kingdom at war. She would need permission, protection, companions. The world beyond Domrémy had rules, and every one of them stood in her way.
At first, Jeanne spoke only to people she trusted. We do not know every conversation. History rarely preserves ordinary words exchanged inside ordinary homes. But later testimony makes one thing clear. Those closest to her struggled to understand what she was saying. How could they not? She was asking them to believe something that seemed impossible. Not difficult, impossible. A farmer's daughter wished to leave home, travel through dangerous territory, meet the Dauphin of France, and help save the kingdom. Even saying the words aloud must have sounded extraordinary.
It is easy for us to forget this. We already know how the story ends. The people around Jeanne knew only the beginning. And beginnings often appear unbelievable. Some surely worried for her safety. Others may have hoped the idea would quietly pass with time. Perhaps they thought she was simply too young, or that life would soon return to its familiar rhythm. History does not record every opinion. It records only the path that remained.
Jean did not argue loudly. She did not demand that others agree. According to the records that survive, she remained remarkably consistent. The same conviction, the same calm certainty, the same quiet determination. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Nothing about her purpose seemed to weaken. If anything, it grew steadier.
Eventually, One name began to appear in conversation: Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, a man responsible for defending this frontier on behalf of Charles. If anyone could provide an escort toward the royal court, it was him. The idea itself sounded almost absurd. Why would an experienced military commander agree to receive an unknown village girl? Why would he risk soldiers, horses, and valuable time because of a request unlike any he had ever heard? There were every reason to refuse. Jeanne knew that. The people around her knew that. Perhaps even Baudricourt himself would soon know it.
Still, every long journey begins the same way. Someone reaches for a door that has never before been opened. Jeanne had now reached that moment. Beyond Domrémy, beyond the familiar fields, beyond the river that had shaped her childhood, another road was waiting. And at the end of that road stood a man whose answer could stop her story or allow it to begin.
The road to Vaucouleurs was longer than any journey Jeanne had ever made. With every mile, the familiar world of Domrémy faded a little farther behind her. The quiet river, the village church, the fields she had known since childhood. They belonged to another life now. Ahead stood a frontier town built for a kingdom at war. Long before its walls came into view, Jeanne could hear it. The distant strike of a blacksmith's hammer, the creak of heavily loaded wagons, voices echoing beyond the gates.
Unlike the peaceful rhythm of Domrémy, Vaucouleurs never seemed completely still. Soldiers moved along the walls. Messengers arrived at all hours. Horses were saddled almost as quickly as they were unsaddled. Every day brought fresh reports from a kingdom that seemed to grow more uncertain with each passing month. For Jeanne, everything felt unfamiliar. Stone towers rose above the surrounding countryside. Watchmen scanned the roads from the battlements. The gates opened only after careful inspection of those waiting outside. War had taught the town to be cautious.
Inside those walls lived Robert de Baudricourt, captain of Vaucouleurs, a soldier, a nobleman, a man responsible for protecting this dangerous frontier in the name of Charles. His world could hardly have been more different from Jeanne's. He measured problems in supplies, soldiers, and fortifications. She spoke of conviction, faith, and a mission she believed had been entrusted to her. Soon they would meet.
The historical record cannot tell us every word that was spoken during their first conversation. It can, however, tell us how that meeting ended. Baudricourt did not believe her. From his point of view, there was little reason to do so. An unknown village girl had arrived asking for an armed escort across a country divided by war because she believed she had been called to help the Dauphin. No experienced commander would grant such a request lightly. Some later accounts suggest he advised her family to take her home. Whether those words were spoken exactly as later remembered cannot be known with certainty. What is beyond dispute is that Jeanne left without the permission she had hoped to receive.
For many people, that would have been the end. The journey had failed. The answer had been no. The road back to Domrémy must have felt much longer than the road that had brought her there. The same forests, the same villages, the same muddy tracks. Yet nothing looked quite the same, because she now understood something that had only been an idea before. Believing in a calling was one thing, convincing the world was another. Most people, after hearing such a refusal, would have accepted reality as it stood. They would have returned to the life they already knew. History is full of dreams that ended behind closed doors.
Jeanne's did not. She carried no written permission, no royal seal,
No promise of help, only the same quiet certainty with which she had first left Domrémy. As the towers of Vaucouleurs disappeared behind her, one thing became clear. The first door had remained closed, but Jeanne had not turned back. And sometimes, history changes because one person refuses to believe that the first closed door is the last one.
Jean returned to Domrémy. The road was the same. The hills had not moved. The river Meuse still flowed quietly past the village. The bell of St. Remy Church continued to mark the hours, just as it always had. To anyone watching from a distance, it seemed that nothing had changed. But failure has a strange way of changing the person who carries it. The first door had remained closed. Robert de Baudricourt had refused to help her. The journey had ended exactly where most people would have expected it to end. For almost anyone else, that would have been enough.
Life in Domrémy welcomed her back without asking questions. The fields still needed tending. Animals still needed feeding. The seasons waited for no one. Spring quietly gave way to summer. Summer slowly leaned toward autumn. Every ordinary day invited Jeanne to forget the impossible dream she had carried beyond the village. It would have been the easier life, a safer life, a life no one would have questioned. History is filled with people who accepted such lives. There is nothing shameful in that.
Yet Jeanne could not return to being the person she had been before leaving. According to her own testimony, the conviction she carried did not weaken after the refusal. It grew stronger. She continued to pray. She continued to work beside her family. She continued to wait. Waiting is one of history's least celebrated forms of courage. There are battles fought with swords, and there are battles fought in silence.
Meanwhile, France continued to struggle. News reached Domrémy the same way it always had, one traveller at a time. A merchant spoke of another defeat. A pilgrim repeated worrying rumours from the Loire Valley. Messengers carried reports that few villagers fully understood, yet everyone recognized the growing unease behind them. The kingdom was running out of victories. Charles still had supporters. He still held territory. But every month that passed seemed to strengthen those who believed his cause was already lost. Hope, once weakened, is difficult to restore.
Jean listened carefully whenever travellers stopped in the village. She asked questions. Not many, just enough to understand how the world beyond Domrémy was changing. The names of distant towns no longer sounded unfamiliar. Neither did the names of commanders, nor the Dauphin himself. The road she had travelled once no longer felt impossible. It felt unfinished. There is an important difference. An impossible journey ends with failure. An unfinished journey waits for another beginning. As autumn deepened, the evenings arrived earlier. Families gathered once more around their hearths. Outside, the wind carried fallen leaves across the empty lanes of the village. Inside, life continued much as it always had. Yet somewhere beyond the quiet valley, events were moving toward a moment that would demand another decision. Jeanne could not know exactly when that moment would come, only that it would. One refusal had not ended her journey. It had prepared her for the next attempt, and before long, the road to Vaucouleurs would call her once again. The road to Vaucouleurs had not changed. The same fields stretched toward the horizon. The same forests bordered the winding track. The same hills rose gently beneath the changing sky. Yet Jeanne was not the same traveller who had walked this road before.
The first journey had been filled with hope. The second carried something quieter, resolve. She already knew what waited beyond the town walls. Questions, doubt, perhaps another refusal. Even so, she continued.
The gates of Vaucouleurs came into view late in the afternoon. Soldiers still watched from the walls. Merchants still waited beside loaded wagons. Blacksmiths still worked beside glowing forges. Life inside the frontier town moved with the restless rhythm of a kingdom at war. Yet one thing had changed. Not the town, the stories. During the months since Jeanne's first visit, France had not grown safer. Reports from the north spoke of continuing hardship. The siege of Orléans weighed heavily upon Charles and his supporters. Each new messenger seemed to carry another reminder that time was running short.
When hope becomes scarce, people begin listening to voices they might once have ignored. Jeanne did not arrive with new arguments. She did not suddenly possess wealth, influence, or noble birth. She brought exactly what she had carried before: the same certainty, the same calm, the same request. Robert de Baudricourt saw her again. Perhaps he expected that disappointment would have changed her mind. Instead, he found the same young woman standing before him with the same unwavering conviction.
History cannot preserve every expression upon his face. It cannot record every pause in the conversation. But it does preserve something more important. His certainty was no longer complete. Around him, others had begun to notice Jean as well. Some dismissed her. Some quietly admired her determination. A few began to wonder whether such persistence deserved another hearing. No single conversation transformed opinion overnight. Real life seldom works that way. Trust grows slowly, like dawn, almost too gradually to notice. Then, one day, the landscape looks entirely different.
Baudricourt remained cautious. He had every reason to be. Granting an escort across dangerous territory was no small decision. If Jeanne failed, responsibility would fall upon him. If she succeeded, no one could yet imagine what that might mean. Outside the captain's residence, the sounds of the town continued without interruption. Hammers struck iron. Horses crossed the marketplace. Messengers arrived through the gates. Life went on, unaware that a quiet conversation inside one stone building might soon alter the course of a kingdom.
Then something unexpected happened. Not a miracle, not a revelation, simply a decision. Robert de Baudricourt agreed to help. Not because every doubt had disappeared, but because refusing Jeanne no longer seemed as certain as it once had. History often remembers the great victories. Far less often does it remember the quiet moment that made those victories possible. This was one of those moments. The gate that had remained closed the first time had opened just enough for history to step through. And for the first time since leaving Domrémy, Jeanne's journey was no longer hers alone. Others were now willing to walk the road beside her.
Before dawn, Domrémy was still asleep. No voices drifted through the narrow lanes. No smoke yet rose from the cottages. Even the familiar bell of St. Remy Church had not announced the beginning of a new day. Only the quiet sound of horses disturbed the morning silence. The small escort gathered outside the village while darkness still rested over the valley. The men checked their saddles without speaking much. They understood the road ahead would not be easy. Jeanne stood beside them.
For a moment, she looked back. The village looked exactly as it always had. The rooftops, the fields, the trees beside the river Meuse.
Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. She had walked these paths since childhood. She knew where the road flooded after heavy rain. She knew which willow leaned furthest over the river. She knew the sound of the church bell carried farther on cold mornings than warm ones. This place had shaped every memory she possessed. Now, she was leaving it behind. No farewell ceremony marked the moment. No crowd gathered to watch. History rarely pauses to announce itself. Sometimes it slips away before sunrise. The horses began to move, slowly at first. Their hooves pressed into the damp earth as the little company followed the road northward. With every step, Domrémy grew smaller. Soon the church tower disappeared behind the trees. Then the rooftops vanished. At last, even the valley itself was hidden by the morning mist. Jeanne never lived in her village again. She could not have known that. Neither could anyone riding beside her. To them, this was simply another journey. One that might succeed, one that might fail. No one could imagine that it would become one of the most famous journeys in French history. The road stretched onward through forests still heavy with dew. Birdsong slowly replaced the silence of dawn. By midday, they passed villages where no one recognized Jeanne's name. To strangers, she was simply another young traveler, riding with an armed escort. Nothing more. Yet every mile carried her farther from the life she had always known.
The world itself seemed to grow larger. Roads became busier, market towns more crowded. Stone churches rose above villages, larger than any she had seen before. Merchants spoke with unfamiliar accents. Pilgrims told stories from distant provinces. Messengers hurried past without stopping, carrying news that could not wait. France was revealing itself one road at a time. It was far larger than the quiet valley where Jeanne had spent her childhood, far more wounded, far more uncertain.
The deeper they travelled, the more visible the marks of war became. A burned farmhouse standing alone beside an empty field, a bridge repaired in haste after earlier destruction. Villagers who looked first at the riders' weapons before offering a greeting. These were quiet reminders that the kingdom was living through dangerous years.
No battle had yet been fought, no king had yet been crowned, and still the journey itself was already changing Jeanne. Every road left another village behind. Every sunrise carried her closer to a world that had once existed only in stories. Ahead lay Chinon. Ahead lay Charles. Ahead lay a meeting that almost no one believed could ever happen. But on this first day, none of those things could be seen.
There was only the road, endless, silent, disappearing into the morning light. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the next chapter of history was already waiting.
After many days on the road, the landscape began to change once again. The forests slowly gave way to broader valleys. Vineyards climbed gentle hillsides. Villages grew larger, and the roads became busier than any Jeanne had ever known. Merchants passed with heavily loaded wagons. Mounted messengers urged their horses onward without stopping. Pilgrims rested beside roadside chapels before continuing their journeys. The farther they travelled, the more it became clear that France was not one country living one story. Every region seemed different. The accents changed, the food changed, even the churches carried their own character. Yet everywhere,
people spoke of the same uncertainty: the war, the Dauphin, the future.
One cold afternoon, someone riding ahead quietly pointed toward the horizon. There. At first, Jeanne saw only the river. It curved through the valley like a silver ribbon beneath the winter sky. Then, high above the water, a fortress slowly emerged from the mist. Stone towers, high walls, dark roofs rising above the cliffs. Chinon. For most people in Domrémy, castles belonged to stories. Children imagined them while listening to travelling monks or wandering musicians. Few expected to stand before one. Yet here it was, real, silent, watching over the valley.
Jean's small company crossed the bridge leading toward the town below. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Shopkeepers called to passing customers. Blacksmiths worked beside glowing forges. Children chased one another through narrow streets. Dogs barked as strangers entered the town. No one stopped to stare at Jean. To everyone around her, she was simply another traveller arriving after a long journey. History often hides itself inside ordinary moments. The castle gates stood open. Guards examined newcomers with practiced caution before allowing them to enter.
No one here was waiting for a village girl. In truth, very few people even knew she had arrived. According to the surviving records, Jeanne did not immediately stand before Charles. She waited. Others questioned her. Word quietly spread through the castle that an unusual visitor from Lorraine claimed she had travelled across France because she believed God had sent her to help save the kingdom. Some laughed. Some shrugged. Some were curious enough to ask another question. That curiosity was the first door to open. Not a gate, not a throne room, simply curiosity.
No one here was waiting for a village girl. In truth, very few people even knew she had arrived. According to the surviving records, Jeanne did not immediately stand before Charles. She waited. Others questioned her. Word quietly spread through the castle that an unusual visitor from Lorraine claimed she had travelled across France because she believed God had sent her to help save the kingdom. Some laughed. Some shrugged. Some were curious enough to ask another question. That curiosity was the first door to open. Not a gate, not a throne room, simply curiosity.
As evening settled over Chinon, candles appeared one by one behind the castle windows. The river below reflected their light, just as the river Meuse had reflected the dawn in Domrémy. So much had changed, and yet Jeanne remained the same young woman who had once stood listening to the church bell in a quiet farming village. Tomorrow, she would step into a room where every word mattered. Tonight, she was simply waiting. Sometimes, history does not change with the sound of trumpets. Sometimes, it changes while someone waits for a door to open.
Morning arrived quietly over Chinon. From the castle windows, the river Vienne shimmered beneath the pale sky, while servants, guards, and messengers moved through the corridors with the practiced rhythm of another ordinary day. For them, it was simply another morning at court. For Jeanne, it was the morning she had travelled hundreds of miles to reach. Somewhere inside the castle was Charles, the Dauphin of France, the man she believed she had been sent to find.
It is one of the most famous moments in medieval history. It is also one of the most debated. According to later accounts, Charles wished to test the young woman from Domrémy before granting her his confidence. One tradition says that he stood among members of his court, while another nobleman occupied a more prominent place,
waiting to see whether Jeanne would recognize him. The story has been told for centuries. Some historians consider it entirely possible. Others believe later writers added dramatic details as the legend of Jeanne grew. The surviving evidence does not allow us to know exactly how every moment unfolded. What we do know is far more important. Jeanne was brought before Charles.
Imagine the room for a moment. Nobles dressed in fine fabrics, churchmen watching carefully, experienced soldiers standing quietly against the walls, advisors who had spent years debating how to save a kingdom that seemed to be slipping away, and among them, a 17-year-old farmer's daughter. She carried no title, no noble ancestry, no military reputation, nothing that should have earned her a place in such a gathering. Yet there she stood.
According to the sources, Jeanne addressed Charles with confidence and respect. She did not speak like someone asking for wealth or influence. She spoke like someone who believed she had been entrusted with a responsibility. Their conversation was held largely in private. No complete record survives. Historians therefore resist the temptation to invent what was said. That silence, in many ways, has become part of the mystery. Whatever passed between them, it mattered.
The court did not suddenly erupt with celebration. There was no instant declaration that France had found its saviour. Real history is rarely so dramatic. Questions remained, many questions. Who was this young woman? Could her claims be trusted? Had she deceived herself? Or was she truly carrying a purpose that no one else yet understood? Charles refused to answer those questions in haste. He would seek advice. He would ask church authorities to examine Jeanne carefully before placing the future of his kingdom, or even a part of it, in her hands. It was the decision of a cautious ruler, and perhaps the wisest one he could have made.
As Jeanne left the hall that day, nothing visible had changed. The English still held strong positions across France. Orléans was still under siege. Charles was still uncrowned. The kingdom remained divided. Yet beneath the quiet routine of the castle, something almost impossible to measure had begun. For the first time, the future of France no longer seemed entirely beyond imagination. And before a sword would ever be raised, one young woman would first have to answer the questions of the church.
Charles did not give Jeanne an army, not immediately. For a kingdom already weakened by decades of war, belief alone was not enough. Extraordinary claims demanded careful examination. Before anyone could decide whether Jeanne should accompany the French forces, another question had to be answered. Who was she? The answer could not come from soldiers, nor from noblemen. It would come from the church. Jeanne was sent to the city of Poitiers, where respected theologians and church officials gathered to meet her. The journey was shorter than the one from Domrémy to Chinon, yet it carried a different weight. This time she was not travelling toward a king. She was travelling toward judgment.
The room where the questioning took place was quiet. Candles flickered against stone walls. Sheets of parchment rested on heavy wooden tables. Men who had spent their lives studying scripture looked carefully at the young woman standing before them. Some were curious, some were cautious. None wished to make a careless mistake. If Jeanne spoke the truth, France could not afford to ignore her. If she did not, the consequences might be just as serious.
The questions came one after another. Where had she grown up? What had she experienced? Why did she believe God had chosen her? How could she be certain? The examination lasted for several days, perhaps even longer. Not every word has survived.
Many records from Poitiers have been lost, yet later testimony allows historians to understand its purpose. The theologians were not trying to prove Jeanne's mission. That would have been impossible. Instead, they were looking for signs of deception, pride, contradiction, heresy, anything that would make her claims impossible to accept.
Again and again, Jeanne answered calmly. She did not speak as someone trying to impress learned men. She answered as someone who believed she had nothing to hide. One reply, preserved in later sources, became especially well known. When asked for a sign proving that her mission came from God, Jeanne answered that the sign would be given not in this room, but at Orléans. It was a remarkable response. She did not ask them to believe because of clever arguments. She asked them to wait. History would answer.
Whether every sentence has reached us exactly as it was spoken can never be known with complete certainty, but the impression she left is far less disputed. The men who questioned her found no reason to dismiss her as a fraud or a heretic. That did not mean every doubt disappeared. It did mean one important obstacle had been removed. When the examinations came to an end, Charles received the advice he had been waiting for. The theologians could not prove Jeanne's mission, neither could they find sufficient reason to condemn it. In uncertain times, that conclusion carried enormous weight.
For the first time since leaving the quiet fields of Domrémy, the path ahead no longer seemed blocked. The doors that had once remained firmly closed were beginning, one by one, to open. Soon, Jeanne would exchange the simple dress of a farmer's daughter for armor. Soon she would ride with soldiers instead of travelers. Soon the kingdom that had questioned her would watch to see whether her promise could survive the battlefield. And beyond the walls of Orléans, history was already waiting.